What is it that people are seeing? Is it a man? An animal? A myth? Or something else? Are they delusional? Are they lying? Some are pastors. Some are law enforcement. Some are military. If they are delusional liars, why do we trust them to lead us to God? To put people in jail and to protect our way of life? Why are their words and actions good enough for that? But when it comes to experiencing something out of the ordinary, something fascinating, something possibly terrifying, they become a fool, a joke, an idiot. Not here. We are the Big Dog T2B. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Jack.
Yes, sir.
So it would be interesting.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jack, and welcome to the Big Dog T2B. Tonight we have part 2 of our show with Reverend Dave. Along with Reverend Dave, we have the founder of the Big Dog T2B, Nathan Bowling, and Tim Coonbo Baker. In our previous show, Reverend Dave asked a question about the database and feeding residue, or signs of violent activity. The database has a question as to physical evidence. Specifically, the question asks, what type of physical evidence did you find? Choose all that apply. The information on the website is just a little bit out of date. The replies available for selection are as follows: footprints, handprints, hair, structure, tree break, scat, bedding area / nest, feeding residue, dead pet / animal, and other. Feeding residue, as a response, was selected 4 times out of 190 reports. Dead pet / animal was selected twice. Feeding residue, chosen 4 times in 190 reports, represents 2% of the total reports received. If we combine feeding residue with dead pet / animal for a total of 6 positive responses, this represents 3% out of 190 reports. During this episode, I couldn't remember the name of a YouTuber doing Sasquatch research on the Nephilim. That researcher is Scott Carpenter. Well, enough of all that. Let's get on with the show.
With your particular expertise, and I'll leave it at that as far as how much you want to share with the public, but in your professional opinion, knowing this particular set of data, when you look at it analytically, I would think that this would be a significant portion that could be added to your database.
There are inherent difficulties anytime you talk about data and databases. And the main difficulty is, we have it with this database, is perception. So in the variable skill set of the individual filling out the report. And at one point I had tried to make the questionnaire into a tree so that when you answered yes or no to certain questions, it took you down a different road where you didn't have to answer as many questions, or it asked you more specific questions about something.
It'd just be interesting to know how many encounters involve, which I've in my own personal research since I
Mhm.
got involved in this topic, my own personal research, there is quite a bit or quite a few physical encounters and sightings that involve predation of to some degree. And I'm sure the other
Mhm.
gentlemen on the call will attest to that they have heard and or seen such behavior over their lifetime.
We do have a couple of minor questions about that as far as observations go, aren't direct sighting related. So that is there, and I could go back and pull the data up and give you a little bit of information about that. The one thing that I wish that I had added, which trends at a rate if you pay close attention, is how many people, regular people, have their first sighting, their first encounter associated with a significant trauma in their life. A death in the family, a divorce, things like that, a significant trauma. It is listening to different podcasts and reading some of the reports in the database. It trends in a way that I wish I had added that to the database, but we've got so many data samples now. Adding that at this point would be a lot of math. I'm trying to weigh out whether or not that would be useful. And that takes us down into a road. If these things can sense that, or can sense things about humans, and dogs do these things. I train dogs, and your dog knowing that you had a bad day when you don't say anything, walk any differently, talk differently, carry yourself any differently. It could be a different version of that, but is there something else? Is there some other connection, ability, and what some people call the woo road and the Nephilim? And Dave, you're a reverend, and I know that this is kind of your wheelhouse and that you've done significant study on it. I know that Coonbo's done a lot of significant study on it. You guys want to compare notes on any of that stuff?
I'd be happy to. I can give you my general thoughts on the matter. Unless Tim wants to go first. You good with me starting there, Tim?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Well, my general thoughts on the matter, when it comes to the woo, what people typically label as woo, the supernatural component, if you will, to this topic, I'm of the belief, and Jack and I have talked extensively about this, so he kind of knows where I'm coming from here. I personally think that people who have these woo type encounters where they see orbs or other phenomenon associated with Bigfoot, I don't think they can be discounted just because it doesn't fit in the paradigm. And I'll explain this why. You don't have to divorce yourself from the natural order of things for the supernatural to be true. Typically, I think of woo encounters as just natural phenomenon that we haven't quantified yet or evolved ourselves out of. That's my general take on the woo thing.
Well, Dave, you don't know that much about me, but I was a scientist for a research and development test and evaluation engineer for the government for years. I worked both for NASA and for the Army Missile Command and other entities. I did a lot of testing on nuclear plant equipment for Navy and such as that, as well as other things. During this time, when I was traveling extensively for the government, and when I started learning about how widespread Bigfoot was, and especially on a lot of these government installations, how many of them there were, and I'm learning about things, and I'm finding out more about things that happen around them. And one of the first things I figured out was that they use infrasound. Well, at that point, we were doing a lot of seismic simulation for nuclear plants around the country. doing seismic simulation testing required by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Everything safety related in nuclear plants had to be seismically qualified. And we were testing from about 0.5 up to about 30 hertz. Whereas the range of infrasound is from about 0 up to, or say 0.1, 0.5, up to about 20 hertz. And I started noticing the effects of some of this stuff. And we had even played around with using infrasound on people and seeing what it would do. You know, we'd heard about some of Tesla's supposed work and how he had a little shake table. They'd get out on it. And,
The brown
you know,
frequency.
and he discovered a lot of different things about the human body. Well, we found that there were certain people that could come back in the lab area, and we could have the capability of generating some pretty good infrasound, and occasionally we would get lucky, and it would have the desired effect on someone, and we could get rid of them. But, you know, or they would leave the area or something. Anyway, now, fast forward a few years. I am down in the state park here in the state of Alabama, where there has been many sightings. And I and my first wife and my children were walking around a trail headed to a power line right away where there had been a lot of sightings on this trail as well as on this power line right away. I'm walking along, and all of a sudden, out of my peripheral vision to my right, this gray-colored, round, fuzzy-edged object or orb, it wasn't glowing, it was gray, comes shooting out of some brush, goes flying along an undulating path, but pretty fast, and then just dives over, disappears over into some brush about 40 to 50 yards in front of me. I'm like, did you see that? Did you see that? Of course, my wife nor my kids had seen it. I'm like, dadgum, what were you know, how could you not have seen that? And they weren't looking that way, I thought. And dadgum, I wish you'd seen it. Well, I was very reluctant to say anything about that to any of my Bigfoot friends, because that gets over into the woo category. All right. Fast forward another 15 years. I'm doing some studying and reading about infrasound and using it as a weapon and such as that. I come across an interesting article that was put out by some people that weren't even remotely connected to the Bigfoot world. I actually found this. Part of my job that I had then was one of the guys, I was the main guy in charge of the day-to-day operation of the maintenance of a large maintenance department, 100-something people, at a university up in northern Missouri. And one of the things that I was looking at was unhealthy buildings. And we had found a building on campus where people didn't like classrooms in this one part of the building, and they were uneasy in there. They didn't do good on tests in these classrooms. And we got to looking and found out that somebody in the past had changed some pulleys in an air handler, and big squirrel cage fan in the air handler for that part of the building was producing a standing wave resonance in the duct that was right in the middle of the infrasound frequency range or bandwidth at around 11 to 12 hertz. We even had some professor. There was a professor there that was wanting to move her office out of that part of the building because she just hated that office. She couldn't do any work in there. Just everything was bad about it. We went in there without telling anybody and changed the pulleys out that drove this squirrel cage blower back to the OEM sizes, which killed the resonant frequency that was being excited in the air duct work. It took it out of the infrasound range. And we let that go for a week or two, and then started asking some of the professors that taught in there, and some of them had offices in the area. Oh, wow. Everything's nice. I hadn't even thought about it. Okay. In the process of doing a bunch of that got me interested in studying unhealthy buildings, things that make buildings unhealthy. And lo and behold, I came across a study, and it's repeatable in the laboratory, where infrasound can cause at certain frequencies that are around 10 hertz or so, or 9.5 hertz, somewhere around the frequency of the eyeball, the resonant frequency of the eyeball, can cause apparitions. And it's very repeatable in the laboratory. And that area where I saw that apparition, I am convinced that I was being hit by infrasound. And that's what caused me to see that orb or whatever the hell that thing was that I saw.
So when it comes to those orbs, I understand fully what you're talking about. The weaponization of sound is not a new science. It was in practice all the way back into the Old Testament. I mean, the weaponization of sound is my belief, the combination of the frequencies emitted from the shofar, the vibrational frequency from the people marching around Jericho is what caused the collapse of the walls of Jericho.
I'm convinced of that as well. And now, think about what was happening to our embassy staff down in Cuba.
Well, we do it now for riot control inside the prison. Sirens, bullhorns. It's not to that level. Theory is sound. And as far as the orbs go, I'll take it a step further. There was a study out of, I believe it was the University of San Diego, that if you bombard the face of water with particular sound frequency, it will create the full spectrum of light. The sound actually on water creates light. And that kind of fits in Genesis 1, doesn't it? God said, let there be light, and there was. And this was before he even hung the sun in the sky.
When we were testing the space shuttle, the ceramic tiles that protect the space shuttle from burning up on re-entry, we had an acoustic chamber where we could generate 165 plus decibels of sound. It was a multi-frequency sound. It went down into the infrasound range and it went up into the ultrasound range, which is the range above 20,000 hertz. And while we were doing that test, there was a get up into that acoustic chamber. There was about a 15-inch or so step up into the chamber, 15 to 18 inches. And the technicians were having to lift this big, heavy Craftsman roll-around toolbox up in there. And they got tired of doing it, so during one of the tests, they rolled that toolbox over there and put it in a corner of the acoustic chamber and left it for this test. And this was about a 90-second to 2-minute test. When we went back in the chamber after the test, that toolbox was shredded and basically gone. The toolbox had been torn up into $50 to silver dollar sized pieces, the sheet metal. The tools themselves looked intact, but when they were in there picking the tools up off the floor, they clinked some of them together and they literally fell apart. The metal in these Craftsman and Snap-on tools had crystallized in that short amount of time. And you pick up a socket and drop it on the floor and it just, shatter. And that's when I realized how powerful sound could be under certain conditions. And what they were doing to our embassy staff down in Cuba is they were not using infrasound on them, because infrasound, anybody that has a good subwoofer in their stereo system, you know that you can't really tell where that sound is coming from. You cannot direct infrasound, the sound frequencies below the level of human hearing, ultra low frequencies. But you can direct ultrasound, which is the higher frequency. That is very directional. So what they were doing is they had a ultrasonic carrier wave or drone wave that they were shooting into the different rooms of the embassy. And then they were superimposing on that another ultrasonic frequency and they were varying it up and down, above and below that drone frequency, and changing the frequency of the variation. They were changing not only the amplitude of the variation, but the frequency of the variation, above and below the drone frequency. And they were able to very precisely aim that, and it was ruining their hearing and causing disorientation and just all kind of problems, disrupting their sleep cycles, and it's really screwing them up. And the bad thing about it is a lot of this damage that was done to them is permanent, is irreversible.
Also, along with that, that should have caused variations in heart rate and respiration, if I remember correctly.
Correct. And the interesting thing, they were able, by changing the amplitude and the frequency of the variation of the overriding ultrasonic beam, they were able to duplicate some of the effects of infrasound using these two dissonant ultrasonic frequencies. And we found out doing these acoustic tests for NASA that can be very destructive. And I got to thinking about that. And in my study of the Bible and studying what the Israelites used and what the angels used, the angels used kudu horn shofars. The Israelites used goat horn shofars. They have different frequency ranges. One of our fellow researchers has a goat horn shofar, and he brought it with him on one of our outings. We blew it. We blew mine and his. Unfortunately, at the time, we hadn't figured out that we ought to be blowing them together to see what happens. But, they sounded different. But I believe, based on we saw how they can tear steel apart in just seconds at the right decibel level and everything at the right frequency, that's how they brought down the walls of Jericho. They actually broke down the rock in the walls. And, rock is a very crystalline material. And that ultrasonic frequencies start fracturing the crystalline structure of materials.
Well, ultrasonic frequencies have been speculated by some in this particular field of research is how a lot of the monolithic structures throughout the world, how they moved some of those 20 and 60 some ton stones into vertical positions. Some speculate that it was with harmonics and with vibrational frequency.
Correct. We move things like that now.
All you have to do is, if you have a subwoofer in your car and a speaker box, you set something on top of that box, and when that bass hits real hard, what does that object do? It shakes and rattles. It's thereby being moved by the vibrational frequency of the bass. So you just scale that up, however that is done, and there you go. You move objects with sound.
Vibration reduces friction.
Correct.
Coonbo know the application for it. There's a table that you can use in setting heavy equipment on it, and you can turn it on, and it works like the old electric football games that had players that you put on it, and it went zzz, and your little players moved around. Same premise, larger scale. Vibration, energy, oscillation makes contact intermittent, and by that it reduces friction, and those things move that normally wouldn't move. I've got a separate question theory based on this when you guys get done with this one.
One of the things they use a lot in different mining industries is vibratory feeders to feed material into out of hoppers onto conveyor belts and such. They use vibratory feeders, and there's very few moving parts, and they're extremely effective. They will move tons of materials in very short times. When I was a co-op student back in the 70s working for Harvard International, we were going into some of these places where they stockpile the materials. You'll big, huge piles, and underneath those piles would be these feeders that would pull the material out of the bottom of the piles and send them up to conveyors where they were mixed and blended and such as that. And we were going around replacing reciprocating feeders with vibratory feeders because they were so much more efficient. I was amazed at the difference. And
ultrasonic sinks. So I have a theory on that's kind of maybe down the, not kind of maybe, it's absolutely down the woo road.
Mhm.
But it would give an explanation to a phenomenon that some people call marking. You familiar with that term, Dave?
Yeah, only because you and I have talked about it. I wasn't until that time.
Coonbo, are you familiar with what I'm talking about, marking?
I sort of know what if it's sort of the deal. If once you've seen one or been exposed to one, then you much more easily will see more. You're sort of marked. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Correct.
Yeah.
Are you going down the pineal gland road right now?
Nope. My question is, in going down the science road with it, is matter is slow moving energy. And we have a perception of energy, and this is one of the things that gives to that multi-dimension, multiverse kind of thing, that if we can only perceive in between this and this, and there are infinite frequencies, then we could have a complete other reality in the same place operating at a different frequency that we can't perceive, but they can.
Correct.
Anything that, okay. So, in that those realities theoretically are infinite, all happening at the same time in the same place.
I 100% concur and agree with that assessment.
Correct. Well, that's one of the most common themes in a lot of sci-fi stuff. If you watch any of the Star Trek series, that kind of stuff is brought up many times.
Yes.
But it has proof. I mean, hell, we used to on the shuttle all the time, we would fly ultraviolet and infrared telescopes. They see things in the universe that you can't see in normal visible light.
So, going down this marking thing, if we go down maybe a separate entity, we go down maybe the Nephilim road or a version of Nephilim. If I was to go back right now 2,000 years with my cell phone still connected to Google, I would be God. And that's not to blaspheme, that's just a reality. I believe that there is something greater than me. The chances of this universe being an accident or a single power big enough to do it is just so far beyond my comprehension. It's like a tornado flying through a junkyard and assembling a fully functional 747, right? It's just pretty incredible.
That's
but
right.
With this thing of coming in contact with something and going back into what I said, what I wish I'd put in the database earlier, trauma, and whether or not that is perceivable on a frequency. We all put off an electromagnetic field. Some people call it aura. There, you can lay down and see. We all have an energy Coriolis, and you can put your finger on stuff and see it. Right? It can be measured. It's not make believe. One of my questions is in this theory is that if something like this, an encounter with these things, changed you in a way that was relatively consistent, right? Your reaction to it, whether it be mental, biological, physical, something, changed you in such a way, do you have a shift in your EM field based upon that? And because of that, they come to you or they see you or they make their presence known. And is that same type of trauma that people go through, does that change them in a like way that makes these things come see, make themselves visible to people that are in a significant trauma in their life? I know that's pretty out there, but it's a question.
It's not as out there as you might think, Jack. You want me to tackle this one first, Coonbo?
Yes, go ahead.
Well, I can just speak on it from I personally believe that that is highly, not just possible, I think that's probable. Every living thing has a vibratory rate. Everything. And changes in your emotional state will change that vibratory rate. And if these things are associated with something along the lines of the Nephilim, which is my belief, that entity would be able to theoretically pick up on those changes even if they're very subtle. And this can be proven even in our visible plane. When World War II ended and we brought, with Operation Paperclip, the Nazi scientists over here to do for us what they were doing for Hitler, let's be honest. One of those programs was Operation Monarch, which involved the ill treatment of a person in their youth, typically prepubescent, to instill trauma, to make the brain, in its physiological sense, develop a wall to wall off that trauma. And then that creates a sub-personality that can be your Manchurian candidate, can be weaponized, that can be spies. And that person, by use of a trigger, whatever it is, audible, visual, whatever stimuli is introduced to cause that particular personality to come to the forefront, that person is vibrating, if you will, at an entirely different oscillatory rate than the core person is. Does that make sense? So scientifically, it has been done by our own governments to one degree or another. To think that it cannot happen in nature, to me, in something that is as sophisticated as the earth, to me, lends it more past the possible into the probable. That's my answer.
I agree with it. Yeah.
Take, for instance, Coonbo. Is exposed as a child. Coonbo has a high rate of success compared to most of the rest of the world. Nate, at a very young age, had a long, lengthy encounter. And because of that, these things have different points set up shop around his house. I forget what the guy's name is. I don't hold enough water to call anybody a liar, but he's the guy that was big down the Nephilim road, been on different TV shows. I forget what his name is. But one followed him home into town and was in the tree across the street. The people in the home thought that it was Peeping Tom, and it was seen by the people in that family and neighbors. And all they saw was a dark figure. This guy recognized it for what he, at least him personally, he knew it to be. So it's that thing of, is there that physiological change in that? Because Coonbo's experienced it. Nate and I have reports of it here locally around the Huntsville area of basically things appearing that look like they're using a cloaking device like the Predator. And is that a soft spot or an overlap in those frequencies, in between those realities? And once somebody is traumatized to that way, does that make those other frequencies perceptible to them?
I would say yes, and I would say it on just take a simple analogy. You and I, let's just say we have never corresponded, we've never talked, we've never met. We pass each other on the street. Within a matter of seconds, most likely you're going to know, speaking of us two, that both of us served in the armed forces. You're going to know just by the way you carry yourself. You're more apt to pick up on subtle clues because you've already been exposed to it. And no words or communication have to be spoken. Now that is kind of that theory on a simplest form, and we see it evident in twins a lot of times. When twins are born, they can know where their brother or sister is. They're across the world. They could just have that feeling that they know what they're going through. They know they've been in an accident. And we find this repeatable in statistical analysis all over the world. So I personally, in perfect alignment, perfect agreement with your theory on marking, if that is your working theory. I personally believe that it can be done because it can be done to varying degrees by laymen.
Think about the connection that you can have with your dog. I worked right after my present wife and I got married. I was working for Home Depot, and my hours varied every day. And my wife never knew what time I was going to be coming home from work. But she knew within about 30 to 45 minutes when I was going to be home, because two of our dogs, Bo and Peepers, would get up and go sit in the foyer there in the front of the house, and our front door had a window on either side of it. Bo would sit by the east window, and Peepers would sit by the west window, and I always came from the east. And she said they would sit down there 30 to 45 minutes before I got home. And it was about a 50-minute drive from where I worked to where we lived. And then she would know when I was within about 10 minutes, because they would both stand up and they would stand there looking out the window wagging their tails. Then she'd know when I was within like 2 or 3 minutes, because they'd start getting excited. And the last thing that you were down in a sort of a valley, in a river valley, and there was no way they could have heard me down there, and there was no way they could see me or anything, because right as you were coming into town, you went up a hill 2 or 3 blocks long. Then you were there, and you didn't hit that hill till within 30 seconds or so of when I'd be home. But they always knew. And she got to telling me this. I was astounded. How do those dogs know? How do they know? And I see it when my wife comes home. Duke, one of our German Shepherds, he starts all this whining and stuff when she'll be getting close to home. And sure enough, within 5-10 minutes, she's here. So if animals can have that, somehow they can feel us, they detect us. There's something out there. There's something going on.
Question on infrasound.
Uh-huh.
Infrasound by its definition is below human hearing.
Correct.
But you have spoken of being able to hear it to a degree.
Yeah, I
and
can.
Now when I say hear is oscillating the eardrum, and the eardrum isn't the only thing that can vibrate. Is it after you've been exposed one time or frequently that becomes more easily perceivable? Are you perceiving the effects, the nausea, the deteriorating mental capacities, that thing, or is it an actual?
It's both, Jack. Once you know what it is and how it affects you, because it affects different people different ways. Things that don't bother me, will make some people go just right into anaphylactic shock. Things that do bother me, other people, it doesn't bother them at all. But also, one of the things that I've noticed is that the mature adults are much more effective at generating it than the juvies. And the juvies, it's just like pubescent kids, the kids that are just entering puberty, their voice starts breaking, their voice starts deepening. They can try to sing bass at that point, but, they can't hit the really low notes. And I have noticed many times, researching, when these things would be using infrasound on us, sometimes I could hear this humming noise, hear this, sort of a wah, wah, kind of a noise, but it's really, really low. You can just barely hear it. but you can hear it and you can feel it. I think it's some of the juvies trying to do infrasound, but they just can't get their voice low enough to keep it all below the threshold of hearing. So that's part of it. Plus, like I said earlier, you become, once you are pretty sure that you've been exposed to it a few times and you've seen it affecting you and the people around you, then you're much more sensitive to it in the future. You're much more attuned to what's going on.
It sounds like a cat purring to me.
Correct.
It sounds a whole lot like a cat purring to me. And I agree with you what you said about the juveniles, the not so mature, because if you remember on that outing we went to at your farm, the first place that we went with Greg House was near Brushy Creek. And we had come back down to that logging road, and we all got out of the truck.
Correct.
I had one of those hearing things where you put the earbuds and the thing on your belt. And I have always wondered, people talk about the silence. I've heard the silence. Anybody that's been around boogers for any length of time will hear the silence. But I would get to asking myself, okay, what does a cricket or a caseta or a tree frog, what do they care if a booger's around? That night we got out of the truck, got a habit. I'll take my thermal and my listening device and I'll walk away from everybody and I'll try to see if there's anything there when we arrive. And then if anything approaches us. Well, that night, the night sounds, if you'll remember, were just deafening. And then they would just stop.
Yeah.
Well, with that listening device that I had, when the night sounds would stop, I could hear what sounded like a cat purring. When that would stop, the night sounds would start back.
Correct.
And that is the first time, and I've noticed it several times in several places. But in the marking thing that y'all are talking about, I have always said that there is some reason, take me, you, a few other people that we know, for instance, how many times have you or I been in close proximity to a booger? I mean, with just the thermals that Jack's got on our website that I have taken myself, and it seems to be a reoccurring habitual thing. All right. On the other hand, you've got people who have spent their entire life tromping around in the woods, never seen one, couldn't convince them under no circumstances they exist. I believe that for some reason, whether it be as complex as the things y'all are talking about, or just simply reading somebody's personality, like a dog will do. Dog, some people they just like, some people they don't.
Absolutely.
Is that, whether it's something as complex as the scientific part of it, or just as natural as a sixth sense, these things expose themselves repeatedly to some people, and some people they don't ever reveal themselves to. It can be something, because I don't necessarily believe they're Nephilim. And I have a reason for that. I read the Bible from cover to cover, and you either take part of it or none of it. And to my way of thinking, God is perfect. The God we serve is perfect. The flood was to get rid of the evil in the world, the Nephilim, the things that God never intended for to exist in the first place. If that's the case, and the God we serve is perfect, there are no Nephilim. Now, there's a lot of gray area there, but that's my comfort zone. That's where I choose to be, because as long as they're flesh and blood, I can deal with them. You get into that other stuff, that gets above my potential. As long as I feel like I can kill it, I can deal with it.
You guys know my joke for that.
What is your joke?
So I'm a worst case scenario kind of guy, and this is why I don't like putting the woo or the Nephilim or anything like that on my radar, because of the worst case scenario. And as a worst case scenario, say that I'm spending some quality time in my bedroom with my wife, and Bigfoot, Nephilim, woo thing decides to jump through a portal into my bedroom. and start mind speaking to me about how he wants to make me the white in an Oreo. That's bad. That'll leave a mark right there.
Hey, Jack, from one married man to another, I highly doubt that there's going to be, even if there's such a thing as a Bigfoot jumping through a portal, I hate to even speculate that as one married man to another, I find it highly unlikely that he's going to jump through the portal and catch a married man having sex with his wife, because you said you do, she don't.
Agreed. But stranger things have happened. Another standing joke for me going into a doctor's office is that I don't want to end up as a YouTube video of a Sasquatch sighting in their office. I am extremely hairy, so I would maybe stand a higher chance if I'm naked. They think I'm a kinfolk.
Can I say something about one of Nate's or two of Nate's points there for a second? So yes, Nate is 100% right. God is perfect. When he sent the flood, it was to do exactly as Nate said. It was to wipe this invasive, for lack of a better term, species off of the planet. However, you see, if you continue to read, that there was another outbreak of this type of incident after the flood, which is where we get Goliath of Gath and his 4 other brothers, King Og of Bashan, all these people who were of the Nephilim bloodline. You can be of the Nephilim bloodline and not be full-blown Nephilim, much as you can pass down genetic traits to your offspring and them not be exactly you, carbon copies. Matter of fact, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that one of the things that Hitler was doing in World War II, especially toward the end, he was very big into the occult. And he was actually trying with a program called Lebensborn to backbreed to pure Nephilim bloodline. That's where you get a lot of these elitists and things doing these programs like 23andMe, Ancestry.com. They are trying to locate the genetic material needed to make what they call and refer to as the God Man or the super soldier programs. I think it's highly plausible that these things are genetic, at least to some degree, genetically connected to the Nephilim bloodline. The Genesis 6 account of this outbreak of the Nephilim, that's where you find it initially. You can also find it detailed in the book of Enoch, who was the 7th generation down from Adam. You will find that this is indeed the case. That would mean that the human side of things is maternal, and the male side of this would be, let's just say, supernatural. Okay? That would mean that the nuclear DNA is unquantifiable, which just happens to be the result of Dr. Ketchum's research and her Bigfoot samples, is that the maternal DNA is quantifiable as human, but the nuclear DNA is not in any databases. And that would support the Genesis 6 narrative that these creatures have, at least to some degree, share some of the genetic traits of the Nephilim, which were not, as some people say, the fallen angels. They were the offspring of fallen angels, human females, and then their children in the Hebrew are called Raphaim, which is where we get the more degraded versions, and you start to get the giants of like Goliath and such as that.
If you go back to Greek, Roman mythology, and this is something I've always thought, because I have done a lot of Bible study and I form my own opinions, like God creating the world in 6 days on seventh day rest. I think that is 6 phases of creation. That explains our million-year fossil records and whatnot. But I believe that, people are real quick to say that Greek mythology or Roman mythology is heathen religions. However, I don't believe that. I believe it's a primitive mind passed down through verbal history, trying to make sense of what they saw. I believe all that is based in the Bible. I believe it was the primitive mind trying to make heads or tails out of what they were seeing, just like the prophecies, the end time prophecies. You can go through that all day long and have opinions, but the truth of the matter is the prophecy itself is a primitive mind trying to make heads or tails out of what God was showing them, things that they had never seen before.
When you back this up to, for lack of a better term, the Genesis, it's incredible when you go and you look at the ancient Sumerian text of how much of that structure, for some of them even name parallels, follow through from them. It was Egypt, and then Greek and Roman, and then into the Christian Bible. The structures and the tales and some of the names even stay the same. And for the Sumerians, instead of God and the angels being these things that appeared and were beautiful and did great things, their gods, and for them like subordinate gods, they walked among them. They were physically present. And there's a lot to be said for that. And you do the study of ancient Samaria, where basically we went from stone knives, bear skins, mud huts, and caves to multi-story dwellings, agriculture, animal husbandry, writing, and math on a single character, I believe it's single character base 60 system, right? They counted the creases in the fingers instead of the fingers. 10, first character plus the start over, 1 plus 0 didn't mean you counted all your fingers one time plus 0. Theirs started out with counting the creases in fingers all one time before they started on 2 digits to make a number, right? All of this stuff happened in the course of somewhere, I believe it's like 100, 120,000 years, that they jumped from tool makers and living in caves and mud huts covered in skins to all of this stuff. To my knowledge, they're the first written historical documents. Their history, not their oral history, but their written history, lays all this stuff out, and how the gods came in and the grinding of the plow and all of these things being introduced, and this infatuation with gold that occurred across the planet at the same time. These were tool makers. They needed sharp rocks, blunt things, a soft metal that did nothing but shine, did nothing for these people. And they became absolutely infatuated with it overnight because their gods wanted it, and they wanted a lot of it. And that's kind of the genesis for all of these other religions. And this is not to blaspheme. I'm born and raised a Christian. I really, really, really have faith that God exists and that there's going to be something for me after I'm done with this carcass that I currently inhabit. It's not that thing. But these are the things, when you look at a true genesis of it, of how these things developed and came into being, that's my point of reference.
Yeah, we've got all this study that's been done recently on the Neanderthals. They discovered the Neanderthals interbred with humans, and that they captured human women and bred with them. If you look at the descriptions of the Neanderthals, they very much match the description of the Nephilim. Now there's quite a number of humans walking around with a lot of Neanderthal DNA in them. These might be the people that these people are looking for. You look at that book, Them and Us, and you look at those guys, a rendering of what the Neanderthal really looked like. Well, of course, he took a little artistic liberty. He had vertically slit pupils, and he didn't know how to make the nose. Well, you take the spear away and change his nose a little bit, and put round pupils, you've got a type 2 booger. The southern variety of a booger.
In the reconstruction of pre-humans in Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, all of those, their bone structure is not sapien. Their bone structure is extremely more dense, right?
Exactly.
They have basically great ape bone density. Now, when they did the reconstructions on these things, because they were paid to look for pre-humans, when they did the reconstruction, they used human sapien muscle density and skin density when they went about reconstructing these things. And when you take these things and reconstruct them and you use great ape musculature and skin, you end up with a much different rendition of what the pre-humans and the pre-sapien Homo species, what those things look like.
You get down to looking at it that way, there's a whole lot less mumbo jumbo than what a lot of people want you to believe. It's a lot more cut and dried to me than most people would ever imagine. To me, it's not a stretch at all to think that these Nephilim might have been the Neanderthals. But like you said, that somehow they carried through genetically, and this backbreed that that Hitler was doing, you might be able to be successful at what he was trying. Who knows? I don't know. Extract enough of that DNA and get it concentrated in the right places, and you might be able to make your own Bigfoot.
CRISPR technology. We already know that just the average man that has an Amazon account can toy with genetic manipulation right in his garage. Now, this is technology that the public is recently, let's say within the last 10 years, learning about. What do you think our governments have had 50 years before that? Whatever you can trust and believe. It's been my experience in working both for the government and all four of us on this program have had their toe in this water as working for the federal government at some point. So very well, what they tell us that it's open source information, what they really have is well past that when it comes to the advancements that they've made.
Now, let me just give you a little tiny example of how far we were ahead.
This concludes part 2 of our show with Reverend Dave, and we hope to see you again in part 3. As always, please remember, if you decide to step off the pavement, if you decide to step off the trail and get back into places where people normally don't go, you need to be mentally, physically, and emotionally prepared for what you may encounter. Take care. God bless. We love you. And until next time, have a great day.